In the CNN newsroom, I'm Alex Marquardt in for Ana Cabrera. And when Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton in 2016, he openly called for Russia to hack her emails. And people working on his campaign met with Russian spies who promised to deliver dirt on his rival. Now that he's president, what does he have in mind for 2020? According to Politico, one thing that he's considering is having Attorney General Bill Barr investigate potential rival Joe Biden. Specifically, he seems to be interested in allegations about the connections between Biden's son Hunter and a Ukrainian oligarch. This reporting coming as the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, is standing down on his planned trip to Ukraine. He blamed Democrats for canceling the trip, saying, "They say I was meddling in the election. Ridiculous." But that's still their spin. Now, CNN White House reporter Sarah Westwood joins me with more. Sarah, Democrats were really outraged yesterday when they heard about Giuliani's plans to go to Ukraine. Here is a sample of some of their comments.
Here, Rudy Giuliani is inviting a different foreign nation, Ukraine, to involve itself in our campaign by conducting an investigation of a family member of the rival the president apparently fears most, Joe Biden. They, again, are taking us down that destructive path.
We've come to a very sorry state when it's considered okay for an American politician, never mind an attorney for the president, to go and seek foreign intervention in American politics.
Now, Sarah, we should note that we don't know if the president had any advanced knowledge of Giuliani's travel to Ukraine, but do you think the Democrats will now respond differently if he deploys the same tactic that he did in 2016?
Well, certainly, Alex, Democrats are on heightened alert for this kind of action from the Trump campaign now that we do know the extent of Russian attempts to influence in the 2016 election, although there was no evidence that the Trump campaign worked with the Russians to accomplish this. And Democrats certainly were highly critical of Giuliani's now reversed decision to go to Ukraine to talk to Ukrainian officials about the Biden family. Now, just for some context, this all goes back to events that took place 3 years ago in 2016 when then Vice President Joe Biden was among several Western leaders who pressured the top Ukrainian prosecutor at the time to step down. That Ukrainian prosecutor was investigating a Ukrainian energy company in which Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, had a financial interest. But Biden has told the New York Times through a spokeswoman that he did not take any actions based on his son's business activities. And as I just said, he was not the only leader calling for the ouster of that prosecutor, and there was no evidence that his actions were connected to his son's business. But nonetheless, this is something that conservatives have seized on, and Giuliani reversing that decision to go to Ukraine after an outcry from Democrats, Alex.
And Sarah, what about the other part of this reporting? What kind of response are you hearing from both Democrats and Republicans about the president possibly asking the Attorney General to dig up dirt on Biden?
Well, Alex, we haven't had a lot of reaction to that request or that comment from President Trump that he would consider it within his rights to ask Attorney General Bill Barr to investigate the situation with the Biden family. But of course, if you look back to 2016, President Trump did get quite a lot of criticism and continues to this day for indulging in these lock her up chants by suggesting that the Justice Department should investigate Hillary Clinton for the classified information in her emails, even after she was cleared by the Justice Department. So we have seen the president engage in this tactic before, and he was met with criticism. So it's likely that he could face that again if he goes down this road of calling for an investigation of Joe Biden, Alex.
All right, Sarah Westwood at the White House. Thanks very much. Now, with us now to go through all of this are former New York City prosecutor Paul Callan and former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. We have heard from Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren, gentlemen. She was asked about Giuliani's decision to cancel his trip to Ukraine. Here's what she said.
Senator, Rudy Giuliani canceled his trip to Ukraine last night. What do you have to say about that?
You know, he never should have scheduled it to begin with. I'm glad somebody finally talked some sense into it.
So, Paul, what do you think? Did someone talk some sense into him?
I don't know. Giuliani would be better off going to Hawaii, I think, than Ukraine. I think the publicity relating to this trip has become an embarrassment for the Trump administration. And Giuliani, of all people, should know that Giuliani, is no longer an FBI agent or even a U.S. attorney. And if he suspects criminality, what you do is you call the cops. In other words, you call the FBI or you call the proper people to investigate it, not somebody who is an attorney in private practice.
I mean, someone who's so high profile as well.
Well, not only that, I mean, he should have the political sense to know that this doesn't help the president. It embarrasses the president to see him attempting to provoke a foreign country's investigation of the son of a candidate who's running against Trump. It's bad politics and it's bad law.
And terrible optics.
Yeah.
Now, the president did tell us that this is exactly what he would do before he took office. Listen.
If I win, I am going to instruct my Attorney General to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
Renato, if you could for a moment put yourself in the mind of the president and ask yourself on what level it would be okay to ask the Department of Justice to investigate your political rivals.
It's very difficult for me to put myself in the mind of the president because I'm a lawyer. I respect our legal system and our law enforcement system, and part of that is that we don't initiate prosecutorial decisions or initiate investigations based on a political motive. That's not the way that our justice system is supposed to be used. So I think I'm constructed differently than President Trump. I think perhaps he thinks that since he warned people that that's what he was going to do, that makes this okay. But I will just say, as a former Justice Department prosecutor, that is completely foreign to what I understand the purpose of the Justice Department and our criminal justice system to be.
Gentlemen, let's switch gears here for a second to Paul McGahn. CNN has learned that McGahn, who was the former White House counsel when in the first part of President Trump's first term, that he declined to say publicly the president did not obstruct justice. This is something, however, that he told the Mueller investigators. So why decline to say it publicly, Paul? Why is this significant?
I'm surprised that he wouldn't say it publicly. Now, just to be clear, lawyers don't have to express an opinion about clients they represent. I mean, lawyers represent guilty people sometimes. They don't come out and say, it's my opinion he's guilty. Their job's to present the evidence, the legal evidence in the case. But it's not unusual if a lawyer thinks a client is innocent to express that publicly. And particularly when you're representing the President of the United States and you've said it already to the Mueller investigation. So I think it's rather odd that he won't say that. And I think it hurts the President that his own lawyer is not willing to say he's not guilty of obstruction.
Renato, why do you think he is trying to walk this line and not repeat something publicly that he already said privately?
I'd say a few things. I mean, first, he's also a witness, don't forget. So he's a fact witness as to things that the president did. And I think that makes this more complicated for him because he's witnessed some things. And perhaps after reading the report, I think it's not clear exactly what Mr. McGahn's opinion is. I will say from reading the Mueller report, what I got the sense of is that Mr. McGahn saw his place in history and did not want to do things that he thought were unlawful or shameful. He said at one point he did not want to be initiating the Saturday Night Massacre or being known as the Saturday Night Massacre Robert Bork. And so I think that given that mentality that he has, perhaps he's not sure the president is guilty, and at the same time he doesn't want to anger the White House, so he thinks the best course is to stay silent.
Alex, I think also the issue of privileges come up because the president has been so unclear. On the one hand, being very cooperative with the Mueller investigation and then doing things to try to seemingly obstruct the investigation. Now, McGahn is looking at a situation where the president has said publicly he's going to assert executive privilege. He's going to fight every subpoena that's been issued. And I suppose McGahn is sitting there saying, well, if I get out and start making public statements about the investigation, that will be a waiver of any privileges that the president might ask me to assert later on. So I think that might be his legal reason for doing what he's doing.
Of course, this major question of whether McGahn will actually end up testifying in front of Congress.
Absolutely.
Paul Callan, Renato Mariotti, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, this news just into CNN, rising trip to Ukraine. The purpose of that trip was to look into the origins of the Russia probe and dig up dirt on the president's potential 2020 rival, Joe Biden. This decision comes on the heels, of course, of the Mueller report, which had revealed that the Trump campaign welcomed help from Russia to get negative information on Hillary Clinton in 2016. CNN political commentator and former Clinton White House aide Keith Boykin and CNN political commentator Tara Setmeyer join me now. Tara, first to you. Do you think it was simply the optics of a high-profile Trump aide going to visit a foreign government in the run-up to an election that drove this decision to call off the trip?
I think that was one of the reasons, and the fact that we're even having this conversation is surreal. Did we ever think that in American politics we would have the personal attorney of the President of the United States going over to a foreign country to try to dig up dirt on a political opponent? This is insanity. But this is exactly what Volume 1 was all about in the Mueller report, which I encourage everyone to read, because if you do, you will be horrified by the level of Russian involvement, not only Russian involvement, but by the willingness by the Trump folks to accept stolen information and to be in cahoots with them. I say playing footsies with them, even though it may not have been a criminal conspiracy. It's only because they were too inept to actually go through with it. This is a problem, and the American people should recognize it for what it is. This is not normal. This is not the normal course of political campaigns. I've been in politics for 25 years. This is not normal. And also, there are internal politics going on in Ukraine that were not welcoming to what Rudy Giuliani was trying to do. He was met by a lot of opposition in Kiev, trying to meddle in what was happening there, and he was not welcomed. Even Konstantin Kilimnik, right, who the people know that name from Paul Manafort, a Russian intelligence officer, by the way, even he said, you know, what is Giuliani doing coming over here? There's a new regime coming in, and they were not friendly to Giuliani coming. So I think it was a combination of both things.
And in trying to justify this trip to Ukraine, Giuliani said that there were legitimate questions about Joe Biden's efforts to remove a top Ukrainian prosecutor. That was back in 2016. That prosecutor had years earlier investigated a gas company connected to Biden's son, Hunter. Now, as we see it currently, Joe Biden is at the top of the Democratic polls, leading the field. He very well may be Trump's eventual opponent in the 2020 general election. Before canceling his trip to Ukraine, Giuliani said this: "We're not meddling in an election, we're meddling in an investigation, which we have the right to do. There's nothing illegal about it. Somebody could say it's improper." Keith, what do you think?
Yeah, imagine this. I mean, Donald Trump has been complaining for quite some time now, allegedly, about the supposedly Democrats were spying on him, that the Obama administration was spying on him, and they were misusing the tools of the state in order to do so. Well, Donald Trump has taken this to the nth degree and expanded on this by now using the tools of the presidency to get his own personal attorney to investigate his chief rival, his chief political rival, or his potential chief political rival. And not only that, he's also authorized or attempted to encourage his attorney general to go after his political rivals with investigations that are targeted for political motivations. We've never seen anything like this since the Nixon administration, when President Nixon created his enemies list. This is not what the President of the United States is supposed to do. And if there are any questions, one thing that we do know for sure, the standard is that you are supposed to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Attorney General William Barr have done exactly the opposite. They've created the appearance of impropriety. And this has got to be a disquieting set of circumstances for American people who are watching, thinking that there's no ethical standards in our government anymore.
So when we take these two things together, Tara, the potential trip to Ukraine, which has now been called off, and the president talking about how it might be appropriate for him to talk to the Attorney General Bill Barr about launching an investigation into Biden or his son Hunter. What does that tell you about what the president is thinking right now about Biden and his chances?
Well, it's clear that Trump is afraid of Joe Biden, and he should be. And it's also clear that that the president will always tell us eventually. He'll telegraph eventually what he's really thinking. We don't have to wonder for very long. Either he will have a Twitter tantrum on Twitter, or he'll say it in an interview because he just can't help himself. It's also very revealing that the Attorney General could not say unequivocally that no one in the White House had suggested, inferred, implied, asked him to open up an investigation. The question that Senator Kamala Harris asked him when he testified, he was, trying to avoid actually answering it directly. Well, clearly we know that the President of the United States has no problem whatsoever doing that. It is completely improper. And I just want to set the record straight about something concerning this whole thing with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and any impropriety in Ukraine. That's not true. This is a conspiracy theory being pushed by people on the right that want to discredit Joe Biden to try to create some kind of controversy. The prosecutor that Joe Biden went over to the Ukraine to try to push out, it was legitimate. The guy was corrupt. Right. He was not investigating corruption in Ukraine, and we weren't the only country that wanted him out of there. It was at a time when Ukraine was trying to put forth anti-corruption efforts. That investigation into the company that Hunter Biden was advising, that had ended 2 years prior. So there really is no conspiracy here, but they're ginning it up on the right to try to create one. So hopefully more and more facts will come out that will tamp that down.
Well, it's a very important point. Biden was one of several Western officials, leaders, who had called on the prosecutor to step down. He was not alone in that, as you note. The case was dormant, I believe it was. Then it was eventually dismissed for 2 years, eventually dismissed by the new prosecutor that came in after that prosecutor was removed. Guys, when we look at this Democratic field, which Biden, as we've noted, is at the top of, we have Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is on the cover of this week's Time magazine. And in the cover article, she details, the article about her details her heavy focus on policy and on putting forward all these comprehensive plans for America's biggest problems. Keith, when you look at what she's trying to do, which is really focus on policy, and compare that to what Biden's done so far and the fact that he's at the top of the field, how do you compare? Which strategy do you think is going to be more effective?
Well, I think that maybe the better comparison is between what she's doing and what Donald Trump is doing, because he's not talking about policy at all. He's really talking about just demonizing his opponents and using, like I said, the tools of the government in order to go after them. But I think it's instructive and it's important to see that the Democratic candidates, Elizabeth Warren being the leading among them, are putting out policy ideas. She's talking about specific ideas that she wants to do. Even candidates like Andrew Yang have been talking about policy issues. And the Democrats have 22 candidates who are in the race right now. Elizabeth Warren is the one, I think, who has the most positions that people can see on her website and can see in her speeches and her policy statements.
And we're seeing all those on the screen.
You can see those on the screen as well. And not all of those are going to be popular with everyone, but at least she's talking about the issues. At least she's talking about substantive ideas to move the average American family forward. You can debate whether you agree or disagree. She's not talking about trying to just create fake investigations in order to go after someone. And if Donald Trump has a serious argument to make for re-election, make that argument. If he has an argument against Elizabeth Warren or an argument against Joe Biden, make that argument. Don't make it a personal attack, but that's what we've come to expect from this guy.
Great discussion, guys. Got to leave it there. Keith Boykin, Tara Setmeyer, thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, well, a few days ago, writing, quote, "For 10 months, China has been paying tariffs to the USA. These payments are partially responsible for our great economic results. The tariffs paid to the USA have had little impact on product cost, mostly borne by China." Now, this is not true. So either the president doesn't know how tariffs work, or he does, but realizes they're not that popular politically. Here's Republican Congressman Will Hurd explaining exactly what tariffs actually are.
Ultimately, a tariff, we should think of a tariff like a sales tax. Right? This is good on American consumers, right? So it's going to be more expensive for Americans to buy products, right? And so that is why this has a long-term impact on the U.S. economy.
So here's how tariffs actually work. The U.S. places a tax, aka a tariff, on foreign goods, in this case China. When a U.S. company imports those goods like cell phones or clothes or fish, think about everything that has a sticker that says made in China. Those products, those companies of those products are forced to pay that tariff. Companies can either absorb the extra cost themselves or as they so often do, increase the price of their products. So ultimately, you, the U.S. consumer, ends up paying for these tariffs, not China, not any other country. So joining me now is the former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Robert Holliman, who served under President Obama. Ambassador Holliman, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon.
You're welcome.
Trump's tariffs could end up costing the average American, as we understand it, average American family, I should say, around $800 a year. That's according to Oxford economics estimates. We could see higher prices on products ranging from cell phones to paper towels. In your view, are the president's new tariffs with China worth that cost to the American consumer?
Well, it's a step that certainly other presidents have been reluctant to take because we know that the consequence of having a big tax increase in the United States is not only bad for our economy, but it's also something that's politically difficult. I think one of the challenges that what the president is doing in his tweets by saying for his domestic constituency that China's paying for these, when in fact China knows that they are not paying for these directly, it actually undercuts his negotiating position because he's putting things out that fundamentally China knows is not accurate, which then raises questions about how the rest of the negotiation goes. So I wish he would just call these what they are, say that trade wars are expensive. If there's a case to be made that we should carry out this trade war, then lay out to the American public why we need to pay this price to get a long-term victory. But we shouldn't be saying this is a trade war without a consequence to Americans, because it clearly is one that we will pay for.
One of the things he did lay out to the American public was in a tweet this morning in which he said, quote, "Such an easy way to avoid tariffs, make or produce your goods and products in the good old USA. It's very simple." Robert, nothing about this appears simple, but in your opinion, is it really that simple for American business owners?
Well, what we've seen is the tariffs already that have gone in place. You know, they're now in place for $250 billion of imports. There's a proposal that will come out on Monday for another $300 billion of imports. What we've seen by businesses, particularly small businesses who are looking alternative supplies, that for the most part, they're just looking elsewhere in Asia. They're looking at Vietnam, they're looking at Malaysia, they're looking elsewhere. Very few of those are coming home because we simply don't have the supply chains at home to deal with that on a short-term basis. And so the challenge is that Americans will end up paying more. Clearly, there are major problems with China, and those need to be tackled. But the tax strategy is a really sort of doubling down on a way in which says that Americans are going to have to pay now, with the president's hope that in the long term, Americans will get a good deal. Will remain to be seen how that works out.
Right. Robert, it looked like the trade talks were doing well, that they were about to wrap up, but then we saw them break down this week in Washington. China's vice premier and chief trade negotiator, he said that the U.S. must remove all extra tariffs before a deal can be reached. President Trump clearly thinks he's negotiating from a position of strength, but China certainly doesn't sound scared. So who do you think has the upper hand?
Well, look, I think it's a pretty strong match. I mean, the U.S. has an advantage because our economy is very strong. You certainly talk to people on the Hill and in the White House. They say that we can afford to do this now because the U.S. economy is strong. China exports more to the U.S. than they import from the U.S. But I think the victims in this are most likely to be, first and foremost, the American farmers and others who get subject to retaliation from China. They're the ones who are going to feel the first impact, followed by consumers in the months ahead. So I hope we find a resolution of this. I actually believe that we will. I think that both the U.S. and China do want to come to a deal, but we're not going to see that deal right away. But I suspect that when President Trump and President Xi meet at the G20 in Japan next month, that they'll be on the verge of striking a balance that gets them to a deal.
And a lot of those farmers that you mentioned in states that voted for President Trump. Ambassador Robert Holliman, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, a collision in the Houston Ship Channel. It leaves 9,000 barrels of a gas product spilling into the water. Next, the urgent efforts to contain the leak. You're live in the CNN newsroom. He is being blamed for a train derailment this morning in Mississippi. It happened along the Norfolk Southern line. You can see there some of the 28 rail cars that derailed after the tracks were washed out. Officials are saying that 25 of those 28 cars were empty and no one was hurt. The same storm system has complicated efforts to clean up a large chemical spill in Texas. It happened Friday after a tugboat pushing 2 barges collided with an oil tanker. 9,000 barrels of a gas blending product spilled into the Houston Ship Channel. Here's CNN's Ed Lavandera with the latest.
It has been a week of intense rainfall here in the Houston, Texas area, as another third round of rain is expected to continue falling here this afternoon. So many people here in southeast Texas waiting to see if any more serious flood waters will rise out of the bayous and tributary systems that run their way through this part of southeast Texas into the Gulf of Mexico. The good news is that for most of the last 24 hours, there has been little to no rainfall. So that has given previous floodwaters a chance to recede and really give residents a break, and that should be enough to get most areas through the worst of this flooding. But the renewed rainfall and severe weather is going to be hampering efforts in another problem. In the Houston Ship Channel on Friday afternoon, a vessel collided with 2 barges carrying 50,000 barrels of gasoline blend stock. One of those barges leaked about 9,000 barrels of gasoline blend stock into the Houston Ship Channel. Emergency crews are in the process of trying to contain that spill, and officials also say that one of the other barges with carrying a 25,000 barrel container is capsized but has not ruptured. So they're trying to contain that and make sure none of that oil or gasoline spills into the Houston Ship Channel as well. There is around-the-clock air monitoring going on, although officials here in Texas say that none of those levels have come back harmful for residents in the area, but they are urging residents to stay away from the coastline, to be wary of that, and that they will probably smell the effects of this spill for those residents who live close to the coastline in that area. But so far, no injuries and no reports that this spill is causing any kind of health impacts for the residents in that part of the Houston Ship Channel. Ed Lavandera, CNN, Houston, Texas.
All right, thanks to Ed Lavandera there. Now, police are saying that one set of human remains has been found after an explosion at a Virginia gas station. At least 3 people are still unaccounted for. 4 others were injured and taken to the hospital. Investigators are still trying to figure out what caused the explosion on Friday morning, but they say it doesn't appear suspicious. Now, yesterday would have been his last day of high school, but now his parents are planning Kendrick Castillo's funeral instead. And despite their grief, they are honoring his bravery.
But there's more good and there's more love than there is evil. And that's really the message I feel, that will celebrate my son, our son. Kendrick was that example.
Their emotional tribute to their son just ahead. Dedicated his life to reforming the criminal justice system. Now, in his new show, The Redemption Project, Van brings together victims and their offenders for an opportunity to talk, heal, maybe even forgive. This week, Van introduces us to an activist and a comedian whose 16-year-old daughter was gunned down in a gang-related shooting. Now, her father wants to confront the man who took his child's life.
You already been through a lot. For you to go and sit across from somebody who took your daughter's life, you don't have to do it, man.
That's what a lot of people have been telling me. Some have been even telling me, don't do it.
Why are you doing it?
I've been just imagining when we make eye contact for the first time, what's that going to be like for him and what's it going to be like for me, I'm not going to bring her back, but I want to know it all. I have all these questions that I want to know. Why did they shoot off 40 rounds or whatever it was? Why were they so angry at this guy? Why? And there are some things I want to say to him that I've been carrying around.
Van Jones, the host of The Redemption Project, joins us now. Van, good to see you.
Good to see you.
This murder was huge news in Oakland when she was killed 20 years ago. For our viewers and those of us who don't know the story, tell us what happened.
Well, I mean, this was one of the biggest cases in Oakland about 20 years ago. Loisha Lacey, honor student, model student, beloved, well-known in the community, just happened to be sitting in the wrong car at the wrong time with the wrong guy, and some gang members came and sprayed the car with bullets, and she lost her life. And the young man who was convicted of that murder has been behind bars all these years, and unbeknownst to the family, has gone through his own personal transformation. And so we brought them together. And of course, you know, Donald Lacey, he's a household name in Oakland, California. I mean, in fact, his slogan, "Love Life," which is the name, his daughter, that's what her name means in an African language, is actually the slogan of Oakland. That gives you a sense of how big this case was, how big Donald Lacey was, and how big he is in Oakland. And yet he goes to San Quentin for the first time, just 20 minutes away, and sits down inside that prison. And what happens is so remarkable. I hope people will check it out. It's one of the most transformational, breathtaking things I've ever been a part of in my life.
And Van, as you say, Loisha's father, Donald Lacey, is a very well-known activist and comedian in the Oakland area, and he says that for a parent who's gone through what he has, whose child has been killed, there's really no kind of closure. So what's he looking to get out of when he meets his daughter's killer?
You know, that's the thing about this whole series. I mean, of course, we found, the reason we're doing this series is because I feel that the culture has gone 180 degrees the wrong way in terms of no compassion, no empathy, no forgiveness, no listening. It's all call-out culture, cancel culture. I want to do something in CNN here to go the opposite way. Can we find some opportunity for healing and listening, even when it's very, very difficult? In some of these things, you know, forgiveness is not on the menu. But still, healing can happen because these parents often, they don't know what happened. All they have is a police report and a news story, and that's it. The person who's behind bars never took the stand. They pled the fifth. So 10 years later, 20 years later, they don't know what happened. And so just to actually get across the table and ask basic questions can be incredibly healing. And so that's really, he was just looking for some answers. And but along the way, in this series, you learn a lot about what people go through on both sides of crime.
Yeah, we don't want to, of course, give too much away about what happens when these two men, Donald and Chris, actually sit down together. But what I can say is that it's a very powerful, a very raw, and, of course, an emotional meeting. So what do you think, Van, this tells us about this power of restorative justice and the impact that these kinds of meetings between the victims and the offenders can have?
Well, listen, you know, we have a justice system that's set up a particular way. Basically, they're just trying to determine guilt, innocence, punishment, and move on to the next case. And even this true crime genre, we imagine, well, if we can just find out who done it, you know, who done it. Should this person be exonerated? Should this person go to jail? And then we think, okay, well, now we're done. Well, this is not true crime. This is about the truth long after the crime, 10 years later, 20 years later, where often there still has not been healing. For the person who's, you know, a surviving family member, they still have questions. And sometimes the person who did wrong has actually bettered themselves somehow. And so we're trying to, this is a new genre of television. It's the truth long after the crime and the possibility of healing. And I hope that people take away that restorative justice can actually, you know, there's a need for punishment, but there's also a need for healing and some reconciliation sometimes. And this show begins to paint what that could look like.